Good evening and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is called Atomic Voices and the Dropping of the Bomb on Hiroshima. And I'm very pleased to be joined again by Bernie Carlson from the University of Virginia and to offer you this webinar in partnership with the National Council for History Education. My name is Andy Mink and I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the Center. It's a little eerie for me right now in Durham because of the Hurricane Florence that's bearing down. I want to begin by sending nothing but the best wishes to our colleagues and friends on the eastern part of the state and South Carolina and Virginia. Having grown up on the coast of Virginia and knowing that North Carolina beaches very, very well, I know this is really going to be a catastrophic event, and I hope everyone is safe and has evacuated and the damage is somewhat contained before it's all over. I'll also say that if for some reason the weather turns weird here where I am in Chapel Hill and the webinar is interrupted for some reason tonight, we will make sure to get you information as soon as we can about either rescheduling or give you the materials and the recording to that point. So I don't anticipate any problems. We're probably still another 24 hours or so from feeling the major parts of the effects from the hurricane, but I at least want to give you that heads up in the event that something might happen. Tonight's webinar, as many of you know, is an audio-based webinar that's associated with a PowerPoint that's been curated and put together by an expert in the field, in this case, Bernie Carlson. And even though you can't see us and we can't hear your voices, your participation is a very important part of the webinar itself. If you go to the Go to Training control panel at the very bottom, there's a chat box. Many of you have already greeted the room, you've shared where you're from. I hope you take note that we've got educators and teachers and participants tonight from literally all over the country. And this is the place that we're going to ask you to either respond to open-ended questions that Bernie might ask, that you register your own thoughts, that you ask us questions, that you share links and resources. And my job as the moderator is to mine that chat box and to bring your questions forth for Bernie to consider at the right time. If for some reason your question scrolls out of view or I have moved on and haven't quite got to it, please don't hesitate to write it again, type it again, remind me, ping me, make sure that your voice gets heard. That chat box I've found is a really important way to create this conversation. So it's not just you consuming information that we've put together, but rather participating and engaging with the work that we're doing. As I mentioned, we are very pleased to be offering this as the, I guess it's the 6th episode in this particular grant collaboration with the National Council for History Education. As a current member of the board of directors of NCHE, I could not be more pleased to both work with them, but also to endorse them and the great work that they do in terms of supporting history educators and increasingly educators from other disciplines to really show the way that history can affect and impact and be an important part of the curriculum that we teach. I'm pleased tonight to be joined by Justin Jakovich from Cleveland, who I'm going to invite to share just a little bit of background about the grant and NCHE. Hey, Justin, can you hear me?
Yeah, Andy, how about you? Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Thanks for the nice introduction. I appreciate it. And thank you for everyone who's attending this evening. We're really pleased to work with the National Humanities Center in delivering this webinar series, in addition to a series of in-person professional development that's happening throughout the year at different locations. We have the first of the next series of colloquia for 2019 scheduled at the Kennedy Space Center. This will be the 3rd one that we're doing at the Kennedy Space Center, a colloquium that's called NASA and Flight Technology, also led by tonight's historian, Bernie Carlson. We're really pleased to be able to provide this work with the funding from the Library of Congress. The overall title of the program is Technology's Impact in American History. And tonight's presentation will be a really good example of the type of discussions that we're having around technology's impact in American history. NCHE is committed to the mission of more history, better taught. We advocate for more class time for history, more integration in other disciplines with regard to history, and we provide the better taught part of our mission through those in-person professional development programs and the types of webinars that you'll have this evening. So we're really pleased to be able to do this work. I won't I won't hold you up any further from the main event, and I'm really excited to hear from Bernie tonight. So thanks, Andy. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Justin. I also want to underscore a couple of points that Justin made and remind all of our participants to go to the NCHE website. You can sign up for the colloquia that started in early 2019. We'd also encourage you to join us at the annual conference in Washington, D.C. In March of 2019. And if you're there, please make sure you say hi to myself, to Justin, Bernie, if he's there, since it's just a few hours up the road from Charlottesville. And we would love to count on your support for NCHE in the future. The National Humanities Center is now entering our 41st year of supporting the humanities broadly, both through the support of a scholarship fellowship as well as our education programs. Every year we have a cohort of professors, humanities professors from across the country who apply for and are chosen to spend their time in that building from Labor Day to Memorial Day. And that's where they do their good work, all the scholarship that really is the foundation of what we do as educators. They write their books, they do their research, they create their digital projects, they have conversations. Our education department then is designed to create bridges in which that scholarship can both inform and impact teaching, both at the K-12 level and the university level, but also that our expert teachers can help inform scholars about the best way to present that research. We have a very strong public outreach mission, and ultimately, I think our primary goal is to really articulate the value of the humanities in understanding the world that we live in and understanding the world that we've come from. In education, we do this in a variety of ways. I would encourage you to go to America in Class to access all of our free resources, instructional materials, and lessons. These include primary source collections. These include essays written by scholars, lead scholars in their fields, and it does include some exemplar lesson plans. I'd also encourage you to take a look at our webinar series registration. Many of our fall sessions are just about full. We've almost reached capacity at 200. And so I would encourage you to go in and sign up relatively soon so that you don't miss out on that. We do record all of our sessions, however, and we put them on our YouTube channel. But registering gives you access to the materials, to the readings, to the PowerPoint. And I find that's some of the most important aspects of these webinars that we offer. I also want to point out that we've added a webinar since you may have signed up early in the year or late summer. That session is called Making Sense of the Second Amendment. And we'll be working with really the lead historian on the Second Amendment, Saul Cornell from Fordham University. So that's a new one. And if you signed up for a bunch of webinars right when you went back to school, you might want to revisit our page and take a look at some of these new offerings. Our spring course slate will be opened on November the 14th. So put that in your calendar and you can register for all of our spring sessions then. There are a variety of other free digital assets and resources that we have available for you as a teacher. That includes our podcast series, which invites a short conversation between educators and scholars around using different disciplinary tools in the classroom. It includes digital textbooks that you can download for free from places like iTunes or in Windows-friendly and PDF version from our website. And it also includes a new online course series. Currently, we have 2 courses running on digital literacy in the classroom. Both of our fall sessions are sold out at this point. So our spring courses will be scheduled and be online and open for registration probably in the next week or so. And we'll have digital literacy in the classroom, that is how to make sense of the of critically consuming information in the digital age. We'll also have 2 courses, one on environmental history and one on economic history that will be open in January of 2019. And then finally, we still do an awful lot of face-to-face work. So if you're near the Triangle, if you're near Central Carolina, we would love to have you visit us at the center. Our next symposium is scheduled for September 29th. We'll be working with Andrew Payne from the National Archives in London to really position Caribbean history and Barbados and the transatlantic slave trade in global and world history at the larger frame. So we'd love to have you join that if you're nearby. So that's a quick introduction to the center. Please visit our website or social media anytime to get updates on what we're doing. Tonight's session will take about an hour and a half, or we will end by 8:30 p.m. East Coast time. Once the room is closed, you will receive a survey. And once you complete that survey, you'll be able to download your certificate of attendance. And that certificate will will show that you were here, that you spent these 90 minutes with us, and you can turn that in for continuing ed credit to your administration or to your building principal. So, as an introduction, I really do want to underscore our intent with this grant, and when NCHE and the Humanities Center really began to conceptualize it now almost 2.5 years ago, it really was, I think, to find ways in which STEM fields, technology, engineering, could be enhanced by, and we could find that overlap with the humanities, that there are critical skills that are necessary in understanding both, and that there are it's an important way to understand both the role of technology in American history, but maybe in reverse, how American history has impacted technology. And tonight's lead scholar, Bernie, I don't know if you know this, but the most common guest on the Johnny Carson show was Joan Rivers. You're our Joan Rivers right now. It's wonderful to be able to work with you again. I believe this is our 6th webinar in the last 2 years. And I think we have 3 more scheduled with this grant before it is completed. But Bernie, in some ways, I think encapsulates illustrates the point I was just making, because he's an historian in the School of Engineering. Hey, Bernie, you're up in Charlottesville. What's it like to work amongst all those scientists if you're really a humanist at heart?
Oh, it's a great experience, and they keep you on your toes. I'm now teaching the first year course to engineering students, and so I have 300 nimble minds fresh from high school that I'm helping become scientists and engineers, and it's always a challenge. It's also a great pleasure to be back.
Bernie, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I want to sort of lean on that a little bit. When you get all these engineers, these first-year engineering students, not a single one of them think that they're there to study history. How do you pitch that with them?
Well, you pitch it to them by explaining that if they're going to be effective designers and problem solvers, that they have to be able to think about what customers and consumers are actually going to want. They need to understand the politics and the social forces that are shaping technology, and that the difference between well, as I said last week in class talking about the George Washington Bridge. Good engineers make sure that the bridge doesn't fall down. Great engineers figure out how you're going to pay for it, how you get people excited about it, so that they don't push back when you're building it. And great engineers think about the larger aesthetic and environmental impacts of their work. And so,
hallelujah, Bernie, that's a great answer.
Yeah. And so that's how we do it. That's how I've come to do it. And I won't go into it, but if somebody wants to ask me after we get done, the other great answer I have is this: I simply point to we show them a slide that Steve Jobs often used to say that great products depended on being at the intersection of technology and the humanities. And in one of his product rollouts, he actually had to make up a poster that had technology street going one way and humanities street going the other. So you can almost always invoke Steve Jobs and get students' attention.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Right. So, but I thank you, Andy, and I want to welcome. My computer tells me that there's 110 souls in the digital room with us tonight. I'm delighted that you're all here. If you are coming from the Carolinas, I hope you are well. I hope you're safe and that your family is doing all right. Many of my colleagues here at the University of Virginia and in the community of Charlottesville have family from the Carolinas, and indeed they, much of their time and attention has been devoted in the last few days to worrying about the well-being of their families. And so, our thoughts and prayers go out to them as we wait and see what Hurricane Florence is going to do. Tonight, we're actually going to, in some ways, talk about not necessarily a natural catastrophe, but a man-made catastrophe and sort of the implications that are associated with that man-made catastrophe that we call the bombing of Hiroshima. And to start, Andy, do I have control of the slides, or are you driving the slides tonight, my man?
We both do, but you do have control. And in fact, I just saw your mouse move over to the arrow. So
yeah. Folks, I apologize for that. You'll see that Andy and I have to periodically coordinate to make sure that we all systems are go.
There you go.
Yeah, it looks like they are. So I am by training a historian. I trained in the history of science and technology. I then did some additional postdoc training in business history. And tonight, in some ways, I was thinking about this as I was going over my notes and getting ready. This is a little less about technology, my friends, and more about business, in the sense of that business historians think about organizations, they think about bureaucracy, they think about strategy. And so I start out by pointing out that I don't necessarily do military history, but like many people, when we start talking about military history, the things that come up are really three things: generals, guns, and battles. We were very interested, when we're talking about military history, whether it be the Revolutionary War or it be the war in Afghanistan, who are the leaders that guide a nation through the war? The guns, of course, stands in for the technology that the soldiers or sailors in the Navy used to fight that particular war. And of course, we want to know about the turning points in a war or in a military effort, which are the battles, and what do the soldiers, following their generals, following their officers, use to win that war, and how do they deploy technology to have that succeed? But what I want to suggest tonight is there's even a larger dimension to military history. Military history is in some ways perhaps one of the most profoundly social, is profoundly social, and you could even argue it is one of the most branches of history that is really social, because it's about people, and it's about a whole range of voices that we want our students to be thinking about. That military history is not just about guns, it's not just about generals, and it's not just about battles. That there are other voices that our students need to hear and consider. And my task tonight is to sort of suggest a framework by which we might be able to go about doing that. And so I seem to have lost.
There you go.
There we go. So what stories might we tell that capture these voices about an episode that's really important in American history, namely the dropping of the first atomic bomb? And and then we can tell we can capture those voices by telling several stories that come together. One is this, of course, is at the top. What were the decisions that Presidents Roosevelt and Truman made in 1945 that led to the decision to drop the atomic bomb? We can also tell a story that I call kind of the middle level, which is about the governmental bureaucracy that is involved in any, prosecuting a war, fighting pollution, dealing with hunger. Whatever we ask our government to do, it's executed by a large organization, the bureaucracy. And also part of that bureaucracy is the story that's often not always told, which is the people that actually go get the job done. In this case, it's the crew and the pilot of the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, that actually carried the bomb to Hiroshima. And at the bottom, and we have, really this is the lesson of social history over the last 50 years, is that we have to remember that if we talk about presidents, we also need to talk about the people at the bottom rungs of society, the people that may be the victims of a war or victims of oppression. And in this particular case, we need to pay attention to the voices of the Japanese who suffered so terribly at Hiroshima. So tonight, what I want to do is suggest that in order to capture all those voices, we can layer the story top, middle, and bottom. And one hint of what I want you to be aware of that we're thinking about that's important is that we often overlook that middle layer, that connecting layer. It's easy to do the history of the atomic bomb or any number of 20th century stories by looking at the top and looking at the bottom, but we often overlook what happens in the middle, how the intent of the president or our leaders gets executed by that middle layer, and then in turn has an effect on whether it's various groups or workers or what have you at the bottom. So I've organized this in many ways around sort of kind of several acts, and the first act that I want to do in our talk tonight is to talk about presidents as rational actors. And here I'm drawing a lot on the chapter that you have in the reading materials, The Decision to Drop the Atomic Bomb, which comes from a very useful book. I've enjoyed using it over the years in a variety of classroom settings, called After the Fact by Davison and Little. And they lay out that there are several different ways to narrate the story of the atomic bomb. And one of the narratives that they start with is talking about the top, and talking about our leadership as rational actors. So the story of the atomic bomb begins in as many of you may know, in October of 1939. A few months before that, several German scientists had figured out how to split the atom. Physicists up to that point actively debated in the 1930s whether or not you could actually separate the nucleus and the electrons in an atomic bomb. Could you actually break up the nucleus of an atom? And indeed, my man Nikola Tesla was among many of the scientists who didn't believe that you could actually split the atom. But the scientists in late 1938 in Germany did succeed in doing that, and pretty quickly, word of that research, publications, in fact, about those experiments that were done in Germany, reached the United States, and scientists such as Albert Einstein became very concerned, because they could see that the ability to do this experiment in nuclear fission could lead to a very powerful bomb. And so in October of 1939, a month after the war had actually begun in Europe, Einstein wrote to FDR and issued a warning about this. In response, Roosevelt set up several scientific committees that monitored developments in atomic research, and funded a certain amount of research in and around atomic physics. This led to a success in December of 1942 under the football stadium Stagg Field at the University of Chicago, where they built the first nuclear reactor designed by a very talented emigre from Italy, Enrico Fermi, and there they were able to actually control the split atoms and control the process, which allowed them to then begin to research and think about how you would actually design, make nuclear fuel, make enriched uranium, and then also to how you would actually set off a uncontrolled chain reaction, which would be an atomic bomb. So on the basis of that, Roosevelt ordered a rapid development of the atomic bomb, and General Leslie Groves of the United States Army was placed in charge of it. That was the project, was given the name, the Manhattan Project, in part to disguise it so people weren't aware of it. Groves was a very effective engineer. His major project before he was assigned to take over the atomic bomb he was the chief engineer who supervised the construction of the Pentagon. And ultimately, over the next few years, Groves, working with several industrials in several corporations, particularly DuPont, figured out how to make enough enriched uranium and plutonium to build several bombs, and it ultimately cost about $2 billion there. And I see I've got a specific question. I'm just going to scroll back here from Scott, who says he lives in, lost there, Scott, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Into which category would the workers who enriched the uranium, the fuel, fall? Well, that's a good question. I think you're back to a couple slides. I would argue that the workers at Oak Ridge, and particularly at Hanford, Washington, the two big operations where the United States government worked on this, probably are kind of on the bottom, because they were, for the most part, were never informed until after the war, after the bomb was dropped, what they were actually working on. They simply were being good citizens working on that. And in some cases, there was a certain amount of radiation sickness that at least employees at Hanford experienced, and Hanford still is a Superfund site that requires a lot of work to develop. So anyhow, but the point is Roosevelt makes a series of careful decisions on the basis of what he hears from the scientists. And so you could argue that he was indeed a rational actor. The physicists warned him of the danger. FDR ordered research be undertaken. The research was followed up incrementally as the scientists got positive results. And by 1945, the atomic bomb the United States had the atomic bomb as an option. But is this the whole story? Can we basically sort of say, and everything just sort of fell into place after that? And of course, this leads us to Act Two, and away from rational politics or rational accurate view of the story to, I think, a story that's bureaucratic politics. And this is, I think, where the story actually gets fairly interesting. As all of you know, if you teach U.S. history, a major turning point in American history and in the story of World War II is that having been elected for a fourth term, Roosevelt passed away, and Harry S. Truman, who was his vice president and was suddenly thrust into the presidency and had to take responsibility. On the 7th of May, the war in Europe ended and the Nazis surrendered. And it became a question of what to do about the war in the Pacific, and particularly in trying to decide how to bring an end to the conflict in that part of the world. Truman was at a real disadvantage because he was not part of Roosevelt's inner circle. He was a last-minute choice, indeed, to be on the Democratic ticket in 1944. And so he didn't have years of experience, as did most of the other advisors that had been in the three previous Roosevelt administrations. So Truman and his advisors had to figure out what to do with the war in the Pacific, and should they use the bomb. And they, in 1945, were debating really two big issues. And the first was, did they want Japan to surrender conditionally or unconditionally? And for the most part, the political view was that the Japanese, like the Nazis in Europe, should be made to surrender unconditionally, and that the war should be brought to an end as soon as possible. The second issue was that it was becoming increasingly clear by 1944, 1945, that there were going to be challenges from the Soviet Union, and that Stalin in particular, having had the Nazis invade the Soviet Union beginning in 1940-41, was pretty determined to control Eastern Europe, to have a buffer zone between the West, meaning France and England, and the Soviet heartland, and so that he was probably going to seek to gain control of Eastern Europe, and perhaps even make certain moves to stabilize and control circumstances in Asia. And you have to remember that in this time period, the overall party, literally the party line of the communists is that they were seeking world domination, and the American policymakers took that ideology, or the propaganda of world domination, quite seriously. So within the Truman administration, even though there were these two goals of getting Japan to surrender unconditionally and address the challenges from Stalin, there were different groups had different ideas as to what to do. The military, and particularly the Navy, advocated for the use of continuing use of conventional weapons. The Army Air Force was launching massive bombing raids on Japanese cities. I looked up just before we began tonight's session and was reminded that there was a fire, that the Air Force had launched a firebombing of Tokyo in the June-July timeframe in 1945, which killed 40,000 people and wounded another 80,000. That was a firebombing of Tokyo. Japanese cities were particularly vulnerable to firebombing because a city like Tokyo had an enormous number of wooden buildings, and so a few bombs could basically create a genuine inferno. The Joint Chiefs were concerned that conventional weapons, did have the challenge that if they had to continue their strategy of hopping across from island to island across the Pacific, that if they had to mount a major a major amphibious assault and invasion from Okinawa. It would involve anywhere from 267,000 upwards to even 500,000 American lives. That it would be a major challenge to it would be a major cost to American people. And that is a fact that is often brought up in the decision to drop the atomic bomb, was the concern not to lose the lives of that many American soldiers and sailors. So now I'm just trying to reach down there and grab. There it is, the controller. Every so often the control arrow disappears. Other people, not only the Joint Chiefs, had a view about this, but the Secretary of State, Joseph Grew, who had spent the better part of his career as a diplomat in Asia, argued for a diplomatic solution. The Japanese had made peace overtures, and the one condition was that they didn't want to have their emperor be forced to abdicate. And at the same time, Grew was overruled by Truman's right-hand political advisor, James Burns, who was a holdover from the FDR administration. And Burns warned that if there was conditional surrender, there would be potential domestic risks, and the Democrats would lose power in Congress, and Truman might not even be reelected again in 1948. So concern about domestic politics, as is often happens in American history, shapes our foreign policy.
So Bernie, let me ask you a question about that.
Some questions are coming up, please.
Yeah, and this may be unfair. We may not quite know the answer. And the last thing we want to do is look at the past through today's lens. But on such a monumental decision, on something that really does require all levels of our government to understand what we're about to do, what was your sense of bipartisanship in this time around this kind of choice?
So one of the things that is actually very impressive about, I think, World War II is that, to a certain extent, once America enters the war, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, there is there's relatively little partisan, politics between the Republicans and the Democrats. That everybody agrees to, work together to win the war, and to mobilize. And to some extent, some of the problems that had been separating the Democrats and the Republicans, and forcing the Republicans to take the view of opposing the New Deal were alleviated, because the war brought jobs, and it brought a great deal of prosperity to most Americans and full employment. The people that were in some ways vanquished were the isolationists, who did have a strong position in the election of 1940, and they really basically lost their credibility with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and so there was a fair degree of bipartisan efforts when it came to military policy. But the risks, all of that was going to go away, which is my point here, or James Burns' point in 1945, with the war gone. There would be more active debate across the two parties. And indeed, one of the challenges that is really quite interesting to read the newspapers and magazines from 1946 to about 1949 is how do you make a transition from being a command economy, fully mobilized for war, to a domestic economy. And that was really that was the partisan debate that really consumes from 1919, most of Truman's administration outside on the domestic front is making this transition, and not because people were genuinely afraid that once the war went away, that the Depression would return. It is a good question. Yeah.
A couple of quick questions that are coming in. I'm going to actually start in reverse order. Lawrence Smith asks, how much was the USA motivated to drop the bomb and end the war quickly to prevent further Soviet territorial expansion in East Asia?
I think that was Lawrence. That was a very important issue. Was to send a clear-cut signal to Stalin that we had a weapon of tremendous power, and that that the balance of power had shifted dramatically towards the United States, and as our teenage students would sort of say, Truman was basically telling Stalin, "Don't mess with us." So that was a very important consideration. Then Paul Judgery, I see Paul asks, right, okay, and let me scroll back here. How would an unbiased international community gather to observe the bomb? Did anyone think a rep from Japan would attend? So that takes us to the point that I was just getting to on the bottom of the slide, that that a portion of the scientists that were working on the atomic bomb were thinking about that maybe what you should do is do a demonstration of the bomb. And I don't honestly know whether I think that they were, thinking that neutral parties would attend, that they wouldn't actually get, people from, from Japanese diplomats or military officials to show up there. So, the real worry is prior to the, doing the Trinity test in the summer of 1945 in New Mexico, nobody actually knew whether the bomb was going to actually work and deliver the amount of damage that the scientists and engineers had calculated. Oop, I got one slide there. Thank you. So all of these factors were actively debated by Truman and members of his administration, and the final decision was to use the bomb in order to accomplish three things. One is to bring about the unconditional surrender of Japan. Another was to bring the war to a quick end and avoid losing, tens of thousands of American lives. And could we send a strong signal that would discourage future Soviet aggression? And as Davidson and Little point out in their reading, within the military, and particularly the military, but also the diplomatic circles, already key administration officials had come to the American officials had come to the conclusion that the Soviets were the real enemy. That once Japan and Germany were vanquished, that we were going to face a very different sort of war. It was going to become a very different sort of post-war world that was going to require paying attention to the challenge of the Soviets. Now, one thing that Truman decided not to do was, went against his advisors, is he decided not to share the information about the atomic bomb at the Potsdam Conference in late July 1945. He had already told, Roosevelt had told Churchill about atomic bomb research that the United States was doing in 1943. And so this was an interesting thing that of the big three, two of the three, Churchill and Truman, knew what was going on, but they decided to keep Stalin out. Now, Stalin did have spies, the Soviets did have spies in the United States. They did have an inkling that we were working on it and making progress, and that leads to this interesting exchange, which is, as Truman said, told the Soviets that we had a weapon of unusual destructive force, and Stalin replied that he hoped the U.S. would make good use of it against the Japanese, and that underlines that he was aware that it might very well have been used against him, or used against the Soviet people. So once, and this is an important point that is being made by Davidson and Little in their chapter, which is this: there are standard operating procedures. Once a decision is made by the political leadership to do something like drop the atomic bomb, then there are standard operating procedures that kick in and guide what's going on. And I think this is again, as Andy pointed out, we want to be careful about making comparisons between the situation that we're today's situation and what was happening in 1945, but where we sometimes see a divergence between what the White House thinks you ought to do and what the military does, or the State Department does, or the Commerce Department does, is that it's a divergence between sort of the presidential vision and standard operating procedures, decisions and practices that have been crafted and put in place to keep the government running smoothly. And so but in 1945 there was a standard procedure for which, once a decision was made to undertake a major bombing mission, how would you choose the targets, and when should those targets be hit? So to make that decision, General Groves met with, as you see over the lead scientist on the Manhattan Project, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and the scientists and military officials drew up a list of Japanese cities to be targeted, which is an interesting list. At the top of it is Kyoto, which the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, vetoed because he felt that you could not afford to destroy the ancient and cultural capital of Japan, that the Japanese would be bitter about that for decades to come. The second on the list, and all of the other cities that are on the list are there because they were major industrial centers, but they also were cities where the bomb could be used to good effect because there would be a large number of buildings, particularly sort of concrete buildings, that would be destroyed or knocked down by the blast. So that's how Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagata, and Nagasaki wound up on the list. I'll tell you right now that the reason why the first bomb went to Hiroshima and the second bomb 3 days later went to Nagasaki is Kokura and Nagata were basically had too much cloud cover on the 9th of August, and so they were miraculously spared. And the people of Kokura still, the Japanese that live there, still talk about how lucky they were that it was cloudy that day on the day of the second atomic bomb mission. I'm having a quick look over here before I move on to the next slide, just to make sure. I see Lawrence has made some interesting comments, and I just want to make sure that there's no, he doesn't have, I don't want to miss the question. So looks like we're good. Let me keep rolling here. Yeah. So when I've talked about the atomic bomb, when we do the military technology workshop in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, at the Army Heritage and Education Center, AHEC, and we'll do another session there. We hope with the Library of Congress program in June of 2019. One of the things that the teachers there asked is did anybody, this the question that's on this slide, did anybody think about how radiation might harm the Japanese people in these cities? And the important thing is that apparently no one did, because the scientists were, and the decision makers, to drop down to the bottom point on the slide, were really interested in the thermal, meaning how much heat would be generated by the bomb and how that would be destructive to buildings and people. And they were interested in the blast power. How many tons, how was the bomb equivalent to X, 1,000 tons of TNT? And indeed, that's still how we in a popular sense talk about the power of an atomic bomb. And so we don't really talk about the release of radiation. The scientists, on the Manhattan Project, knew that there was a risk of radiation, but as Alex Wellerstein, a historian of science, has written in a blog and in a number of publications, they weren't especially worried about it. In fact, when they did the test of the first atomic bomb at Trinity in New Mexico, they went out as soon as as soon as the smoke cleared, and they collected pieces of irradiated glass that were made from when the sand was fused together. and they treated it as souvenirs, and they made jewelry out of it. And of course, the tie tacks and cufflinks and necklaces that they made for their wives. A few years later, they basically stopped wearing them when they realized that these things, did have significant amount of radiation, and that's a real problem. And so, as a result, that the scientists weren't particularly worrying about this, Oppenheimer, the leader of the scientific committee working at Los Alamos, didn't warn General Groves, and General Groves, in turn, didn't really bring up the issue with President Truman. And Groves had a hard enough time explaining how the bomb worked, from a technical standpoint to Truman. Because again, Truman didn't come from a scientific background, and this was really cutting edge quantum physics. And so, there was it was not easy to explain how these things work. I remember as a kid, looking at, science books for elementary school students that tried to explain atomic physics. And I have to say that those Cold War books were pretty confusing when I was 9 and 10 years old in the early 60s. So let me go to Act 3. And again, what we're doing here is we've talked about the president, we talked about rational actors, we've now talked about bureaucratic politics. We're still in the middle, and in turn, I want to talk about the people that actually had to deliver the bomb, the military crew of the Enola Gay that flew the mission. So how did the orders get from Washington, D.C. to the Pacific Command? Again, there's a standard operating procedure. The President Truman gave instructions to the Secretary of War, who in turn told the Chief General of the Army, and the Chief General of the Army. Remember, there's no United States Air Force at this particular time. The instructions went to Carl Spaatz, who was the head of the Army Air Force in the Pacific, and he in turn instructed Colonel Paul Tibbits, who was the commander of a B-29 bombing group, the 503rd Unit, to basically do the mission. And Tibbits is an interesting character. I would commend the book that you have a chapter from, The Three Musketeers of the Army Air Force. Tibbits was one of the three one of the three musketeers. It's about three pilots who had an amazing range of bombing missions and were very accomplished military pilots in both the European and Pacific theaters. So Tibbits was really, truly the right guy to basically take on a complicated mission like this. One of the things that they share with us when we are at, again, the Army Heritage Center in Pennsylvania is the hand receipt, which is the document that basically is the paperwork that went with the atomic bomb. In other words, as in true bureaucratic fashion, you don't just sort of drop an atomic bomb off and say, by the way, we brought it over here by ship, but would you put it on this airplane and fly it over and drop it on Japan? You've got a receipt that basically sort of somebody has to basically the bombing officer has to accept the receipt of the bomb and sign off on it. And that's what this document is. And it's quite an interesting document for the students to see. It's all sort of beat up and this way is just because I think the story goes is the bombing officer signed it, put it in his pocket, forgot to hand it in in the excitement after the mission, and his family found it in his pocket decades later.
Hey, Bernie, let me.
We probably got some questions here.
Yeah, I want to interrupt you briefly to say, if for no other reason, I'm going to go back on your screen. If for no other reason, if you sign up for the colloquium in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the being able to go in and see these kinds of documents, put your hands on them, take photographs of them, it's really surreal. It's a Shazam moment, really.
Yeah, it truly is, and we've worked very with Justin and the whole team, and I have worked very closely with just a tremendous set of history specialists at the Heritage Center, and so they lay out materials from the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Vietnam era, and the teachers get to look at them and study them, and and then have this conversation with the experts right there at the Heritage Center, but also among themselves as to what's the best way to use these. How do you use these to engage students? So yes, and they do let you touch the documents. This one they bring out and they show it to you, but they have a facsimile that you can actually pick up and look at the backside and use a magnifying glass on. But yeah, that they let you otherwise look at all sorts of materials. I wanted to understand certain things about the helicopter wars in the use of helicopters in Vietnam, and so I got to read a whole series of what are called after action reports, which come right out of right from the military officers in the field that are basically reporting back to Washington. How is the war going? Are helicopters working the way we think they're going to work in terms of being able to fight the enemy? So there we go. So the mission of Hiroshima involved seven B-29 bombers. So imagine 7 of these planes, and these are among probably some of the biggest and most powerful planes that were developed during World War II, and were able to fly several thousand miles on a single mission and deliver hundreds of tons of bombs on a given location. What's interesting is we often talk about the Enola Gay, which is the plane that you see there, but the mission involved a number of other planes. There was a backup plane, and you'll see why, on Iwo Jima. There were 3 advanced weather planes which fanned out and arrived ahead of the Enola Gay, which was carrying the atomic bomb. The advanced weather planes were there to sort of see what the cloud cover looked like over 3 of those cities that were on the bombing list. And then there were 2 planes that took pictures and actually movies of the bombing run. The crew was a mix of military officers. Almost everybody that is standing is an officer in this picture, and enlisted men, and all of them had significant important roles to play. I've highlighted the names in red because some of the most interesting passages, again, in the Three Musketeers book, involve these particular individuals. And it's interesting just to again to have a picture of sort of what was this particular the experience of being on this bombing run, and this diagram shows you that most of the pilot and the officers are up front in the cockpit. The bomb is occupying a critical place in the bomb bay. It was such a long mission that they actually installed this sort of auxiliary gas tank in the middle of the plane, so they'd have enough fuel to basically make the trip from Tinian to Hiroshima and back. And then a number of the the enlisted men were parked in the back, and the tail gunner, who got a ringside view of what was going on, you'll see the picture that he took in a moment, is actually buttoned up in the back of the plane there all by himself, and once they take off, he's there for the duration of the flight. And again, is to somebody's point there, it helps the students to think about, so what do you think it was like being the tail gunner isolated there in the back? And this also helps you see all the different jobs that have to happen when you're flying on a mission like this. So, okay. And by the way, that diagram should be, and if it isn't, if it isn't in the PDF from the Three Musketeers book, I'll be sure to share it with you. Maybe in like a different chapter, but I'm pretty sure it's right in the chapter that that the Humanities Center people have put up. So this is the timeline of the mission. Tinian is an island that basically the U.S. troops had taken back along with Guam from the Japanese, and they had to basically fly this incredibly long mission all the way, that took I think close to 20 hours. And if they were going to have, if they weren't being, the planes that went ahead, got over and checked out the cities first on the morning of the 6th. So they left earlier than 2:15 local time, and then the Enola Gay took off with the bomb. And if they had any problems, the Enola Gay would have landed on Iwo Jima, and the bomb would have been, saved for another mission. So they had to have a backup plan like that. And when they saw that the weather conditions were fine over the primary target, Hiroshima, that's when Enola Gay proceeded to go to Hiroshima and drop the bomb at 8:15 local time. And it was as many military missions are. It's simultaneously periods of long boredom followed by moments of terror, and at one point they basically threw oranges at each other. But once they actually go into the mission, the officers and the men have a variety of things. Carone, as you may have remembered from that photograph, is the tail gunner. They're on their way to Hiroshima, and Colonel Tibbits, the pilot, the commander of the mission, basically gives them a briefing as to what they are actually carrying, because they weren't told that it was an atomic bomb until they were on their way to Hiroshima. And so the tail gunner's question is it a physicist's nightmare? Which I thought is a really kind of interesting thought for him to have there. Furby is the bombing officer, and as he's looking down the bomb site to make sure when it's going to be dropped, and he's watching it go down, the flash from the explosion nearly blinds him. The tail gunner has a great line about comparing it to to an amusement ride at Coney Island, and probably the most memorable line from any of the officers and crew is Lewis's line, "My God, what have we done?" It was a dangerous mission. It required a really expert pilot. They had to fly in very steadily, in at 30,000 feet. As soon as they dropped the bomb, they had to undertake an evasive maneuver. They had to basically swing this big heavy plane out of the way, basically, sort of go in and make a big turn. And within seconds they were out of there just about in time. But they still were hit by an enormous shock wave. And this is the picture that I mentioned a moment ago, that the tail gunner took below. And Tibbits recalled that the city, as it says there, looked like a turbulent mass of bubbling hot tar, and they could see it already within the first few minutes that countless fires had broken out. Lawrence, that's a good question, whether Iwo Jima is too small for a B-29 runway. Again, that's one of those important questions that we always should follow up on. And I'm looking just quickly here. Scott says, Oak Ridge, that there were three viable bombs at this time, and there wasn't enough enriched uranium to make a fourth bomb. Yes, Scott, that is my understanding, that we had pretty much, used all of the uranium that had been produced at Hannaford and Oak Ridge up to that time, and that there would have been then a delay of probably at least a couple of weeks, if not a couple of months, if they had to basically drop a third atomic bomb, that there wasn't a fourth one waiting in the wings. Tibbits had, again, wrote a memoir, and here's his recollections of it. What it was like, that he remembered clearly seeing the mushroom cloud, and for the first time, and and just how truly large it was. And and again, think about his experiences. I've dropped, he would have gone on a normal bombing run, dropped thousands of pounds of bombs, and done a certain amount of damage. And here they dropped one bomb, and already the city was completely demolished and in flames. I think this is one of the most interesting pictures, and I point this one out because of the irony as we shift now from talking about the crew and everything that they did, and into the next act where we talked about the victims. So the Enola Gay touchdown, and the moment that Tibbits stepped out of the plane, there he is in his flight suit, and he is General Spatz pins a medal on him right then and there. And if you look closely at his left hand, you can see that he's kind of grasping something, and what he's hiding is as he tells in his own book, the only thing he really wanted to do, having succeeded with this mission, being bone tired, having been on edge to carry it off, was he wanted to go and quietly smoke his pipe. And so he's hiding his pipe because he couldn't have a smoke until the general finished giving him his medal. And the crew members all received medals later on.
Hey, Bernie, let me ask you a quick question.
Please.
We know the names, we've seen these people. Was there any rhyme or reason? These were not just randomly chosen members of this plane. I mean, what was there any common denominator between the actors you just introduced us to? Anything that tied them together? Anything special?
Oh yeah. So
why were they there?
Yeah, they were. What would happen is, and this I believe continues to happen, and if we have somebody who's on the show, in the room tonight, it's been in the Air Force, is when you put together a crew for a bomber like this, that crew stays together the whole time. In other words, you don't drop and add people back and forth. Okay, so Tibbits was flying with a co-pilot and a navigator, and some of the enlisted men that had been with him for years. In other words, they were like, they were the A team. They were a well seasoned group. And in fact, one of the interesting things, which we certainly don't have time to do tonight, is the second mission 3 days later is not this well-oiled group. In other words, it's kind of a hybrid group. They bring a pilot. That pilot's plane isn't ready to go, so he has to fly somebody else's plane. So the crew isn't familiar with that plane, and that just breeds a whole set of problems. So the really important thing is this crew had been together for years, and that's why they were able to do the job as effectively as they can. Andy, what do I need to? This is a very good summary of sort of what gives visual images. And do I just
Well, I'll tell you what. Why don't you let me do it, Bernie, and let me say to our audience.
Yeah. So and I'm going to have a quick look at a couple of the questions here, see if I'm missing anything. But please watch this video, which is extremely sums up what we've been talking about here.
Yeah, let me say to the audience that frequently we share video clips in our webinar series, and they seem to go very seamlessly. If for some reason the audio doesn't work for you, or the video glitches for some reason because of the connectivity, you will be getting a recording of tonight's session. You'll also get the actual PowerPoint. So be patient with us just for a moment or two if it doesn't work, but I suspect for most of you that it will. So let me go ahead and play that video clip for you now.
The Enola Gay's mission starts from Tinian in the Marianas. The crew has had their final briefing on weather and air-sea rescue. Only yesterday they have been told of the true power of the weapon they are to carry. The massive bomb has been loaded. At 2:45 in the morning, August 6, 1945, Colonel Tibbits takes the Enola Gay down the runway into the air, beginning the 6.5-hour flight to Japan. Over Iwo Jima, they begin the slow climb to bombing altitude. At 8:15, a weather plane reports from Hiroshima that conditions are good. 2/10 lower and middle, and 2/10 at 15,000 feet. As they approach the target area, the weapon is checked for the last time. At 9:11, 31,000 feet over Hiroshima, the Enola Gay begins the bomb run. At 9:15, the bomb is dropped. The aircraft banks away at high speed. Just 50 seconds later, 15 miles from ground zero, the Enola Gay is rocked by the blast.
Are you there, Bernie?
Yes, I am. And
Good.
and again, I think that's I hope that's a piece of footage that some of you may want to use in your classes, because I think it sums up very well, and gives the students a real sense of how sort of the imagery and the power of what was happening.
Hey, Bernie, before you move on from
Please.
the previous act,
Yeah.
and in fact, I'm going to go back a screen just so I can ask this question.
Sure, absolutely.
What happened to these guys? What happened to Tibbits and these fellows? Did they, it's not a one-to-one, and I feel a little funny making this comparison, but it's in some ways it reminds me of the team that found Osama bin Laden. I mean, today they'd be celebrities, they'd be well-known, actors. What became of them after this event?
So what's really interesting is what often happens with people that are basically very brave and do pull off important missions like this in the military, is they become career military, and they ultimately become a part of the general staff. And what's interesting is with Tibbits and others, he never goes beyond being a colonel, and he does transfer from the Army Air Force in the late 1940s and becomes a colonel in the U.S. Air Force. But because he's primarily a pilot, he's not college trained. He didn't go to he didn't go to West Point. He never moves up. And in fact, the book The Three Musketeers sort of says it's kind of a sort of an ironic thing, which is such a good pilot, such a good Air Force officer, never becomes part of the high command. And it's sort of an irony that you hear somebody that's an accomplished accomplished military pilot, and he doesn't his career, he just basically winds up with a desk job and kind of disappears. And he does write a book. All of the people, which is I think really quite interesting, all of the sort of major, the pilot, the co-pilot, the bombardier, all write memoirs of their careers, and particularly their memories of flying these missions. But they all get medals, but they kind of fade into the background. I wouldn't say that they suffered, but they kind of basically fade into the bureaucracy.
They really are character actors at that point. The faces that we recognize, but you can't quite remember their names.
Yeah, and thank you, Justin. That's a good source that I'll want to look at afterwards. That the Enola Gay crew recalled the first use of the atomic bomb, because again, those first person voices are so important to making this, as several of you observed, come alive for our students. So we need to shift from and I'm mindful of the time, from the talking about the middle layer to talking about the bottom, and so what happens on the ground at Hiroshima, and here's a picture that Tibbits took away from the experience. He signed it. And it shows that just, that how much 70% of the buildings were leveled in Hiroshima, and only a few of these sort of large concrete buildings survived. But more importantly, 70,000 people die within the first few moments of the dropping of the bomb, and another 70,000 in a year or so die from wounds and radiation suffering. And so, the damage is, the catastrophe is easily as bad, if not genuine, significantly worse than even any of the fire bombings. So, So let's talk about a couple. I want to, just talk about a couple of quotes from various individuals that were there and were victims at Hiroshima. This one I think is helpful for our students, because this is the recollection of somebody who was a middle school student when the bomb came down, and and he describes as he saw sort of in the second half of his quote, "I saw a tiny glittering white object about the size of a grain of rice, tinged with yellow and red, which soon grew into a monstrous fireball. It was traveling in my direction. I felt as if it was going to envelop me." So just sort of like, this tiny thing, and then suddenly there's just damage and horror everywhere. And and so that's his recollection. Must warn that the next two slides and quotes are pretty graphic, and are representative of what the sort of memories that the victims had about being there at Hiroshima, at that ground zero.
Hey, before you advance that, Bernie, I'd actually like to bring in a point that Christy just made, and
yeah,
I'm
please.
wondering, you made some choices as you presented this tonight, and I
Right.
really appreciate the acts, the layers, the different roles that people play. Christy asks, maybe the pyramid should be inverted and the victim should be on the top. Can you talk a little bit about the ways, top, bottom, middle? It's a little bit of an arbitrary vocabulary, but on the other hand, how did you organize that for tonight?
Well, I think that I think the part of it was I went with the familiar to the unfamiliar. In other words, if we were to pull down almost any sort of standard U.S. history textbook from say 20 years ago, maybe not today, but 20 years ago, and we sort of said, all right, so what is it? What's the treatment of the atomic bomb, or the decision to drop the atomic bomb? It would have started with the presidents, and maybe there would have been a couple of paragraphs, about what the policymakers and the military officials felt, but there would not have been the treatment of the crew or the people that we're talking about right now. And so my strategy is particularly with an audience that's like you folks that are know the story. Start with the familiar story, and then introduce the unfamiliar. But Christy's right that for really dramatic effect with students who don't necessarily know the story of the atomic bomb, you might start on the with the victims and work your way back to the president, and sort of kind of with a reflection on did they have any idea of exactly how this was going to affect all sorts of people, and then ask the tough ethical questions, which is, should they have known, should they have taken that into account? So yeah, and so let me, while I'm just collecting my thoughts, did we have scientists in Japan that examined the effects, and if so, when? John Hershey, a reporter from the New Yorker who writes a famous book on Hiroshima, is there as soon as in the fall of 1945 to look at the damage. And at that time, I do believe that the U.S. military sent scientists over to make measurements and to sort of assess the situation. And that was, of course, part of the whole group of military, the whole operation to basically, much like Germany, Japan was under a military occupation, and which was under the command of Douglas MacArthur, through 1945, and I must say I don't know my Japanese history well enough to tell you exactly when the occupation ended. But the military, the U.S. Army, studied exactly what had happened in Hiroshima. Okay. Yeah. So here's one voice. Here's a second voice of a young woman in her 20s, and it's the fingertips of the dead bodies catching fire that is so graphic and so kind of just painful to even just kind of try to picture or imagine in this particular quote. And again, I provide these. See, you need to think about, these might be very powerful for high school students, but not appropriate for middle or elementary school students. And another quote is from a doctor. Whoops. I think Andy and I would both simultaneously hit the go button, and so as a result, we didn't go anywhere. And here it's the walking ghosts that moved, quote, as though in pain, like scarecrows, their arms held out from their bodies, with their forearms and hands dangling. And he was puzzled until he suddenly realized that they had been burned and were holding their arms out to prevent the pain of the raw surfaces of the burns from rubbing together. And again, it's such a powerful contrast to, what people were thinking in Washington, what the experiences of the crew, and and the 70,000 people that died and suffered so terribly at Hiroshima.
Hey, Bernie, let me ask you a quick question.
Sure.
How long did it take for these kinds of first-person accounts and entries and descriptions to become public? How long did it take for the word of this to reach America or to reach the world?
So some of this, not necessarily these first-person accounts. I'd have to go back and see when these I think these began to sort of come back and filter back to America. These quotes in the late 1950s, early 1960s, but Americans were aware of the horrendous impact of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, again because a New Yorker reporter, John Hershey, or I should say the New Yorker, basically sent John Hershey to basically report on what had happened. And so it was part of the the awareness and the discussion in America in 1945, 1946, 1947, through reporting from people like Hershey. At the same time, whether it would be actually an interesting exercise for students to go back and look at his book and see how does he capture the voice of the Japanese victims.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So but the other thing is it isn't just yes, 140,000 people were killed or suffered in the months after in the days and months right after the bomb, but tens of thousands of other Japanese suffered with radiation sickness for years, and the incidence of leukemia and other forms of cancer continues to impact generations of Japanese that were there, whose parents and grandparents were present at Nagasaki and Hiroshima when the bombs were dropped.
So just as a quick follow-up, Jonathan Permer, who actually is just down the road in Greensboro, please stay safe, Jonathan. He mentions that he's heard that the information or research on bomb radiation was withheld from the Japanese for a long period of time following the war because it was considered confidential or secret. Is there any truth to that?
I think that there is. I think that certain things about the extent of the radiation damage were withheld from the Japanese people, but whether that's again. How we should think about that is an interesting question. In other words, how long did it take to actually kind of do, if you will, the sort of public health assessment after the fact? I mean, again, being careful to draw out analogies from the present to the past is notice that it took what 6 to 8 months to really kind of assess the death toll in Puerto Rico from Hurricane Maria. And that a lot of that is just sort of catching up with rural hospitals and various other locations and putting the statistics together. So the information may not have been withheld in a sort of conscious propaganda sense as much as it just took a long time to fully understand the damage. And again, back to the same point is that the military leaders and the scientists were not thinking so much about the radiation hazards as they were thinking about the blast damage that the bomb could do. So I think that also there's a story to be followed up in there on that. So Tammy makes the point it's hard to believe that they that they didn't know that there would be damaging radiation. There's evidence that well into the Cold War, U.S. soldiers, in part of their training, in case that they actually had to fight in a war where atomic bombs were used in the battlefield, were sent out to the desert and basically made to watch an atomic bomb and do maneuvers within a mile or two of the blast, well into the 1950s. And so, our understanding of radiation is taken a long time to evolve. And again, it's really kind of a medical history question, but we are much more sensitive to these issues than they, and it took a long time for that sensitivity to evolve. And that it's not an apology, but it's an awareness of, sometimes it takes a long time to understand the hazards. So John asks a good question, but my sense is the Japanese did not know that this attack was possible. That they had no intelligence that the U.S. had a bomb of this sort with this sort of order of magnitude of power. So this is a very interesting quote, but I'm mindful of the time and that other people have to do. And so, Andy, I think it's interesting to hear, sort of and see Truman's view. This is about 4 or 5 minutes, Well,
let's take a minute and look at this.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, if you're all right, let's do that. Yeah.
Yep, Bernie, while it's playing, why don't you take a minute and go through the chat box and see what some questions in your mind, but let's go ahead and play this second clip.
Amelia is the U.S. didn't drop leaflets, but there's an interesting story that the Japanese tried to drop leaflets across the United States using using several dozen balloons that were to drop leaflets, basically to kind of convince Americans in the country, in the rural countryside, to change their views about the war. And the balloons all got blown off course, and only about 2 ever actually landed in the United States. And so it's an interesting sort of obscure side of the story about propaganda.
Okay, so Bernie, I'm going to play the video clip, and if you see any other questions pop up, why don't you take a minute and just respond in the chat box?
Sure will.
Okay, here we go.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware. We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work. And hardly less marvelous has been the capacity of industry to design and of labor to operate the machines and methods to do things never done before. Both science and industry work together under the direction of the United States Army, which achieved a unique success in an amazingly short time. It is doubtful if such another combination could be got together in the world. What has been done is the greatest achievement of organized science in history.
And there we are, Bernie.
Thanks. Yes, I think Truman is on a ship, and I think he's returning from Potsdam or in Europe at the time of this, because as he says, the Potsdam decision on 26th of July was such and such, and he's still on the ship coming back. When they do this film, they do this film and they release it, on the 6th of August. So, okay, so, and I think, and I'm glad we actually did that, Andy, because I think some people, as people pointed out, it's really is important to get that feel for Truman's own voice in this sort of thing. So, in terms of surrender, again, Tibbits and the Enola Gay crew hoped that the Japanese would surrender immediately, but it did take several days for a full damage report to reach the Japanese high command in Tokyo. And in the meantime, we're now, remember, the bomb was dropped on the 6th of August. On the 8th of August, Russia declares war on Japan. But as soon as, but in that time period, they had already decided standard operating procedures kick in, that if the Japanese didn't surrender, within sort of 24 hours, the Army Air Force would just, the machine would keep going, and they would drop a second bomb on Nagasaki on the 9th of August. The Nagasaki run is almost a fiasco. There is a typhoon that they have to fly around, so the mission becomes a lot longer, and the crew is not as well trained and well coordinated as Tibbits and the Enola Gay were, and they narrowly miss losing the bomb before they even get to Japan to drop it. And finally, of course, Japan surrenders on the 14th of August, 1945. So just a couple of final thoughts on this. We've had a good discussion, I think, tonight about this. I'll look at some more questions, but again, I want to argue that that as with many critical events in history, we gain insight by telling multiple stories, and that that the familiar story, as we talked a few moments ago, is to kind of discuss the presidential decisions and maybe a little bit of the bureaucratic infighting, but we don't ever look at the ordinary people that are involved, such as the bomber crew. And my experience in again writing largely not military history but business history is we often forget to look at the managers and the workers that are implementing policy and making decisions and building products or running missions like the crew of the Enola Gay did. And we need to make sure that in any treatment that we strike a balance between the top, the middle, and listen closely to the voices of the victims. And in doing that, we have to deal with the realities of war, which is that it is not all patriotism and leadership and bravery, but that war comes with pain and tragedy and suffering. And that is in many ways what I mean when I suggested earlier tonight that military history might be the most social of all of our histories. And so I appreciate your comments. I'm going to have a quick look over here.
Bernie, I'm going to feed you a couple of questions.
We're winding down here. I know we're right at the cutoff point.
Yep, I'm going to feed you a couple of questions. The first one is I'd like you to address any kind of either implicit or explicit racism in terms of dropping this devastating, catastrophic weapon on the Japanese. And the question actually sort of references Stephen Ambrose, who writes about how in the 1940s, the Japanese were often associated with cockroaches or sort of looked down on as this enemy. What is your sense of this, of there being any kind of racial undertones to this?
There definitely is. I had a colleague who was an environmental history historian at UVA. He's now moved on to Boston University, but he really looked at the use of metaphor with the Japanese and before and during World War II, and how they were regularly regarded as the language, the phraseology was vermin, and that we needed to, much like you would you would exterminate bed bugs, similarly we needed to exterminate the yellow peril. So there is clearly a racist issue, and there historians have reflected on the fact that the kind of counterfactual question is if they had to drop the bomb on the Nazis on Germans, would they have done so? And and there's some thinking that they might not have necessarily done it, but that it was okay to for racial reasons bring this much harm and suffering to the Japanese.
Right. Thank you. And my second question is a little bit different. What is your sense of either the political or scientific acknowledgement that this was the first breakthrough, sort of technology breakthrough in terms of weapon of mass destruction on a continuum? In other words, this was just the beginning, and they were going to develop bigger, better, harder, faster, etc. What sense was that this was only the beginning of what became the nuclear arms race?
I think that there in the scientific community, there was a very clear awareness that, and I think in the U.S. leadership in the 1940s, there was an awareness that as Truman says in that in the newsreel footage, that the best this was a victory of scientific brains. And so there was a realization that science had, produced this sort of weapon of mass destruction for the first time, and that it needed to be carefully controlled. And so, many of the leading scientists in the Manhattan Project became quite, joined various organizations to promote the peaceful development of atomic weapons, and became strong advocates for either never using the bomb, or creating controls and mechanisms to do so. And certainly that was one of the impetuses behind the creation of the United Nations, was that weapons of mass destruction had come to pass, and that the world needed new institutions like the United Nations to control it. And there was a debate about who should control the knowledge of atomic energy in the post-war world. And the decision was made to create what was the Atomic Energy Commission. That the expertise in atomic energy should be controlled by civilians and not be exclusively in the domain of the military. And that is one of the great legacies of, I think, Truman's sort of policy is he really was very thoughtful about the future control of science in the American state.
Right. Bernie, that's a fantastic place to end tonight, I think.
Yes.
I really do want to share my appreciation for you leading tonight's session. It was well attended. There was a lot of great conversation. Bernie, thank you so much for your expertise.
Well, I thank you, Andy, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to do this, and thank you to the 120 folks that were with us tonight. I hope we answered your questions. If there's something else that I can help you with, you certainly can email me, and it would be good to hear from you. Have a good night, and for those in the Southeast, please be safe with the coming rain and hurricane. Good night now.
And I want to thank all of our participants tonight for joining tonight's session in the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. If you'd like to stay updated on current activities and events at the center, please follow us on social media. We have a very active Twitter feed. We also have an active Facebook page. And you can not only see upcoming events, but you can register your thoughts, and you can communicate with folks at the center. Tonight, you will receive an evaluation, and once you complete that evaluation, you will be able to download your certificate of attendance. And again, you can turn that into your administration for continuing ed credit. We'd love to see you at our next webinar series, Tuesday, September 25th. We'll be working with Min Jiang from University of North Carolina at Charlotte. We'll be talking about the internet and privacy and the World Wide Web in China. And we're going to use that as a part of our online course on media literacy in the digital age. If you haven't signed up, please do. I know that the registration has almost reached capacity. Hopefully we'll see you there. Again, I'll echo Bernie's thoughts. If you're in the Southeast, please be safe over the next handful of days. And we do hope to see you again at the next National Humanities Center webinar series. Good night, everyone. Have a great day at school tomorrow.